We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Byrne Power, and I'm coming to you from a day that's supposed to have thunder showers here in Tbilisi on a fine summer day. Plums growing on the trees, grapevines spreading out. Doing pretty good. Yesterday the neighbor's apartment caught fire. That was nice, but everything here is good, so no complaints. So no doubt you've read the title, and yes, this is going to be on Owen Barfield and his notion of final participation. I was listening in on the Bridges of Meaning Discord chat room. Benjamin Boyce was graciously taking a seat at the wheel while Paul Vanderklay was out on vacation. And Andrea was being the hostess du jour. And at some point in the proceedings, one of the people mentioned Owen Barfield's final participation. Now, Boyce had never heard this before and immediately thought it had something to do with the apocalypse. He kept going on about, yeah, I like apocalyptic participation or something. He just didn't get it. When the person tried to explain it to him, he still didn't quite get it. And as I was listening, I realized that this phrase and Owen Barfield's ideas, which have been going around at least certain small circles of YouTube and the internet, have there is some confusion about what the idea is. I first heard of Owen Barfield in a serious way, besides reading about the Inklings, but I first heard about his ideas from Hans Rookmacher in his What is Reality lecture, which I have uploaded in an annotated visual version somewhere around here. And that was back in 1978, I first heard that. I didn't actually get around to reading Barfield until about 81 or 82. And when I did, I found it challenging, to say the least. But I eventually read pretty much everything I could get my hands on Barfield and made his ideas kind of second nature to me. So if you're someone who's been following Barfield more recently, these ideas may be of help. If you're someone who's been reading Barfield for years, we can compare notes. We'll put it that way. Now, one of the problems is that as soon as Benjamin Boyce heard the word final, he immediately thought eschatology. He thought the apocalypse. And that's not an unfamiliar use of the word. However, now one of the problems here with what I'm about to do is that all but one or two of recent books of Barfield's poetry and such, which I have here, all the rest of my Barfield library is back in Alaska in storage. And thank you, by the way, to all the people who have helped me to try to get that here, with everything else that's coming. But what I'm going to be doing is referring to Barfield rather than quoting him. I think I've got enough of his ideas lodged in my brain that I can do that without any undue damage to Barfield. Although I will give you one quote at the very end, something that's meant a lot to me. But again, Barfield himself, and almost everything I'm saying, can be primarily found in his great book, Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry, which came out in 1957. By the way, if you're just stumbling upon this and you're not sure who Owen Barfield is, Owen Barfield was born in 1898 and lived to the ripe old age of 99. He died in 1997. Some people consider him both the first and the last Inkling. And I think there's something to be said for that. His ideas actually influence C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. I don't think Charles Williams so much, but, there was some overlap there. But basically, his ideas really influenced the Inklings. And he studied with Lewis at Oxford after World War I, but due to family pressures, he had to go into work. He became a solicitor, the British term for lawyer, and worked at that profession until quite a long time until he could retire. So in 1957, he put out Saving the Appearances, and the important thing is that phrase, a study in idolatry, and I'll be coming to that in a minute. But everything I'm saying here can basically be found in that book. It's not an easy read, but it's well worth it. And once you've digested it, I think it becomes pretty easy to go back and deal with it. But there are problems, and it's those problems I want to deal with. So, Barfield himself says that final participation doesn't mean anything eschatological. In other words, it's not, the final there shouldn't be taken in terms of this is how we're finally going to end up at the end of time or something like that. I think it has more to do with, we'll discuss participation in a moment here. Then there's the word participation, which I think a lot of people don't understand. What they don't understand, and this is where Rookmacher immediately clued me in when I first heard Rookmacher's What is Reality, which if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to that, because that's, to me, a Rosetta Stone for so many ideas, particularly ideas that, if you care about stuff on my channel, you're going to find more on where those ideas came from that lecture. But the point is this. As Rookmacher points out, participation is an older philosophical word that Barfield has pulled out of Thomas Aquinas and older medieval scholars and put into the present. So in other words, he's not saying by that word participation what you might imply by that word participation. And this is really important. And I think this is probably the source of what I hear as misunderstandings about Barfield's work. In other words, what he's not saying is participating in things like church or school or saluting the flag or participating, singing along with music or something like that. Although I will say, if there is a problem with all of these areas, and there is, eventually these two concepts come together, which is why the confusion is there. Is because I think people hear the word participation and they look around and they say, why don't people participate in church more? Why don't people participate in politics and government more? Why don't they, what is wrong that they don't participate in art? They don't participate, everything now is spectatorship rather than participation. Why don't they? Well, that's a big problem, but it's not directly what Barfield is referring to at all. I do say, though, that as a result of his three-part thesis here, which we'll get to in a second, eventually that is one of the results of losing the original participation. So, he's got three words that are very important. And those three phrases are original participation, and here's the one everyone leaves out, idolatry, it's the subtitle of the book, and final participation. So, if you don't understand the first two concepts, you're not going to understand the third. And what I find is a lot of people have some kind of grasp of the first concept, no understanding of the second, or little understanding of the second, and a kind of a mistaken view of the third. So, what do we mean by original participation? Well, the quickest shorthand way of saying it is he means the original paganism, a participating consciousness in the world. So that if you go to, say, Siberia, and you go to certain shamanistic tribes in the northeast corner of Siberia, and they're reindeer herders, and one of the things they will do is they will see everything through the reindeer. They will have practices through the reindeer. In fact, they'll feed amanita mushrooms to the reindeer, have them urinate, and then drink this as a psychedelic agent. So the original participating consciousness saw spirits in all the trees, saw meaning in everything. I would say almost too much meaning. Meaning in everything. Every tree, every breath of air, every bird that fell was an omen. There were spirits. There was also great taboos, things you could not do. So, you still find this in certain tribes today, in either the Amazon or New Guinea, or sometimes in the Congo forest of Africa. Places that are so remote or difficult to get to. The Congo is tremendously difficult, dark forest to penetrate. That there are tribes living in there who still act the way tribes did before the birth of the modern age. Barfield talks a lot about the participating consciousness. But notice from what I said about taboos, the participating consciousness does not equal good. And one of the important things about Barfield's idea of final participation is it is definitely in no way ever a return to original participation. That is crucial. And here's where Barfield would split companies with anyone from a New Age kind of mentality. That is to say, Barfield is not saying we need to get these things back, because he knows they cannot be got back because of number 2, idolatry. But before getting into idolatry, Barfield also says one of the most important things to happen, and in fact he says one of the least likely things to have ever happened, and what he means by that is if there is simply a materialistic version of evolution, one of the least likely things to have ever occurred is that one group of people, the Jews, would start eliminating participation. And that's what they did. They basically said you cannot worship animals, you cannot worship human forms, God is not to be found in the whirlwind, God is not to be found in the earthquake, but rather in a still small voice. God reveals himself as the Word, as the Logos, as the relationship. And so this, I think, as a Christian, is a revelation. That is to say that there's something enslaving about that original participation. It connects us too much to things. It makes us afraid. Rookmacher, in his What is Reality discussion, mentions that he had friends in Africa who then would be missionaries and try to do work, but they were so ignorant of the culture that they didn't understand that digging a well was really problematic for this tribe because they're letting loose the spirits of the earth. Well, that kind of consciousness is highly problematic, especially, people often say that the people of these tribes are more like the original people. It's impossible to know. But one thing we do know, studying these tribes, for instance, I recently watched a documentary that was done in about 1963 called Dead Birds, and it was about I believe it's the Dani tribe in New Guinea and their ritual warfare, and how they would set up this whole scenario where one side would fight, kill the other side. It's one person on the other side. Then it was their turn to try to get back and get revenge. Well, the thing about these cultures is they don't change. How can they change? Because if you break the taboo, you're in deep trouble. Now, what might happen is a shaman might get another idea, and this might create a split in the tribes. But still, this participating consciousness is really, there is an aspect of enslavement to it. It's easy to romanticize it. And Barfield is not romanticizing the primitive consciousness which sees something in everything. However, what he is saying is that they're not just wrong either. It's not simply that they're enslaved, because there is something in nature, in the natural world, in the created world, that calls to us. Now, in the Bible, in the Psalms, it says, the trees of the fields clap their hands. That's a very different kind of consciousness, because the psalmist knows that that's a metaphor. They're not, but at the same time, they say, but that's real too, which is not like modern consciousness at all. We look and we go like, well, there's a tree there, and ooh, isn't it beautiful? And, but I know people, for instance, in Alaska, who, and I would say pretend. They pretend that there are spirits everywhere. They pretend there's something in the trees. They're trying to go back to the original consciousness. They're trying to be like the natives, who are no longer like the natives used to be. My thought is this, the Bible says that God speaks to us in nature. That is, say, reveals something of God through the universe to us. However, I think that's really funny. Today, if you're watching this, there's a really high probability, really high, that you're watching this on some sort of computer-mediated visual device. That is to say, you're probably, you're one way or another, you've got to be doing that. So, but what's strange is, so we look at images online. Are we connected at all to the natural world? Does that speak to us? I mean, people take these awesome photographs that are like, eco porn. They just like, ooh, look at this cool water. Look at the sunset. Look at these animals. And they put you right in this experience. But does that make people actually care about nature? Or even national parks? This is one of the things I'll be getting to when I get to my tourism and reality series. Do national parks help people to actually appreciate nature? I wouldn't think so. Why? Because it's all stay on the trail, stay on the road. Oh, don't feed the animals. Watch what you do with your garbage. Stay in this hotel, stay in this campsite. What nature? If you're lucky, you'll see it in passing. I mean, I was fortunate when I lived in Alaska that so much of the world around me, apart from this narrow strip of road, was truly, truly, truly wilderness. And if I walked 100 yards, 100 meters off the road, I knew I was somewhere really radically different than I was a few minutes earlier, and that I really had to think totally differently. But, and as I've said before, and I've said this to, I remember I first came up with this in New York, where I said to my friends, if God was speaking to you in nature, how would you know? When was the last time you were actually in nature? So something happened. Now, the Christians came, took the Jewish concept, and basically more or less kept it the same. That God speaks to us somehow through nature. But they were against all forms of participating consciousness in the sense of that we cannot be enslaved by nature. So you didn't worship or reverence the trees. Now, there is a point at which you come to icons in the Orthodox tradition, or the, various forms of paintings and statuary in the Catholic tradition. And this is a separate idea, and in fact, there is a blending of the older participating consciousness with the newer Christian ideas that occurs during the late Roman period and in the Middle Ages. So that, for instance, here in Georgia, the way I see people deal with icons here is not the way I deal with images. That is to say, they have a reverence for them. Now, is that too much? That's a whole issue, and I'm not going to go there. This is not a discussion of icons. And I would say it's very complicated, and I would say there's a lot to be said for the icon, and there are criticisms to be made of the concept. But that's where I'll leave it right now. But here is the point. When we came to the Renaissance, and especially by the time, well, several things happened. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment. Those three things did radically change the viewpoint, particularly of Western civilization in Europe, Western European civilization. And what they did was they put more of an emphasis upon nature, not so much creation, but nature, more of an emphasis upon our ability to, for instance, read the Bible or interpret the world around us individually, and more, finally, with the Enlightenment, pushing God out the door, saying, we've grown up, we don't need you, and starting to look at the world in a completely different way. It starts with the kind of modern science that, say, Galileo or Copernicus or Pascal or Newton were doing. And that was, we want to see, we want to weigh, we want to measure what's there. But it doesn't end there. Eventually, what starts to happen is God is pushed out the door because God can't be weighed and measured. And all that's left is what can be weighed and measured. And what can be weighed and measured no longer has any interior to it. And this is what Barfield means by idolatry. Now, I go into great detail about why I feel that there was this weird, slightly wrong emphasis that eventually creates the world we're in today. And I do this in my Time series. But what Barfield means by idolatry is that an idol is not just that participating consciousness, but a reduction of specific aspects of that that participating consciousness into a simple form. So, suddenly Zeus gets turned into a statue. Suddenly, the way I often explain it is, let's say you were to witness lightning striking a tree, particularly if you are of that participating consciousness. This would be an ecstatic event. This would be an incredible event. And then, let's say, you bring people to the tree and you show them this tree cut in half by the lightning. And then eventually, the tree starts to change in age, but what you do is you cut a piece off, maybe let's shape it like lightning, and you start to keep this thing. And you show it to people. Now, what you've done is reduced the experience into an object. And this is an experience which actually can't be reduced. That is to say, there is no way to get the feel of lightning in a piece of wood. It's not going to happen. And as much as a person may want to explain the lightning and the power of it, essentially what happens is then after a while, the piece of wood substitutes for any experience which generated that sort of thing. Well, that is what Barfield says has happened essentially to the entire universe. Let me say that again. For Barfield, the entire universe has been taken as is, this majestic, glorious, mysterious, complex thing. And we've taken everything out of it, and all that's left are the items. Like I say, the national park isn't nature. It's just what remains of the experience. It is the idol of the experience. So that it doesn't facilitate people returning to nature. It facilitates tourism, which is the least natural way of probably appreciating nature we could possibly find. Barfield, however, says that this idolatrous notion of the universe probably had to happen. That is to say, we had to get to the point, and in a sense, you can see that it is a deformation of the Christian and Jewish ideas, which saw that everything still had meaning. The psalmist could say, the trees of the field clap their hands, and mean it, because he felt just in their movement, in their shape, they were praising God. But the modern person doesn't say that. The modern person says, there's a tree. We can cut it down. It's a big tree. Like, for instance, there's that famous image of a redwood tree in the Pacific Northwest in California. And I actually drove through this once that has a road, just a simple road. You can drive your car through the tree. Well, why not? Doesn't have spirits in it. It's just a tree. And eventually, though, the ecological consciousness would come along and try to reinterpret it and say, well, it's all some systems and such, and we should appreciate the systems. This gets into some complex ideas that are a little bit beyond what I want to talk about today, although one could say that they are in some sense related to final participation. That is to say that we now can appreciate the system of, say, an environment and say that, we don't want to damage the system of the environment. But here is where the rubber meets the road. We can say that all day long and we keep damaging systems. Why? Because we're still in the idolatrous mindset. Even the people who say that they're not still are. Because it is almost impossible to look at trees, to look at shapes and structures and see meaning in them. For the modern person, they always are essentially being a bit of a phony in doing that, because they don't actually feel that in their heart. And there is the question of what is the real reality, which is the question Rookmacher brings up. And like him, I'm not going to answer that, but simply to pose that question. However, now we come to the idea of final participation, which Barfield says is we apprehend final participation through the imagination. So, final participation. What does that mean? As I said before, it does not mean a return to the old paganism, nor does it mean that this is a final eschatological dimension, although on some level maybe we could see it that way. But I believe that in discussing the word imagination, Barfield is kind of hitting the point, and that is that we have to pick something up with our imagination involved, and not so much, it's kind of like we have to go into it, and I don't like the word re-enchantment, because enchant is, it's got a lot of baggage attached to that word. But I would say rather we have to rediscover the meaning of things. And the meaning of things is not what is found simply in the abstraction of science. But Barfield would say the abstraction of science is extremely important But what we're doing is we're in dialogue with it and with the past original participation to come to a new sense of meaning. So, however, there's one thing I really want to state that's important. That, first of all, what Barfield means by imagination here is not simply, Star Wars or the Marvel Comics universe or fairy tales or something. Although I would say Barfield would say there certainly is something in fairy tales. But it's not simply, it's not like, oh, how imaginative. It's not that kind of foofy word that slithers around and people seem to misuse it. It's not that word. Barfield has another word he kind of seems to have coined called figuration. And it's about thinking, and how we can actually put ourselves into seeing ourselves talk. These things get complicated. Read Barfield. By the way, if you ever read Barfield and you think he's complicated, let me just put it to you this way. Saving the appearances is just the step into the Barfield pond. The book I would recommend reading last is his book called What Coleridge Thought, on the Romantic era writer Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And it's just like, oh, that's just like, that took me months and months to get through. There's so much work. But what Barfield is meaning is not simply this being imaginative and creative and all of that. Again, he's using this word in a very specific way. And that is to say, he is saying we have to go inside the thing itself in a way and revivify it, of finding its meaning. Now, part of that is done with an eye to history and the past. Part of that is done in dialogue with science. But at a certain point, science can only take you so far. And he says essentially to get beyond that, well, of course, there's also faith. And he would not call faith an act of the imagination, because we're not just imagining faith. Faith is a relationship. I understand faith is an act of trust and commitment, so that I trust in God. I don't imagine God. And these things get complicated. You can ask about it. But what Barfield is essentially saying, so, for instance, you can see this if you read any books about history, or that you start to get some sense of what it might have been like in the past. And now, of course, the more you can read, the more your imagination can fine-tune those things. If you start off by watching, I don't know, Hollywood movie on World War II or something, and then you can start to get a little bit of an inkling of how life might have been for a soldier. But you'll get closer if you talk to someone who was actually in that war. And there are precious few of those people left, unfortunately. By the way, just as an aside here, there are people, if you're younger, there are people who have had experiences you've never had, and you may bump into them. And you should interrogate those people and find out what they know, because when they're gone, so is so much of what they know. But I feel, for instance, how is it I can watch a movie? There was a movie that came out back in the 1980s called Lady Hawk. It was a pretty good movie. However, it suffered terribly from its musical score, which was by, I might have been by Vangelis. Anyway, it was a very much an electronic score. It suffered terribly from this because there is no connection whatsoever between an electronic score of that sort and the past. And so what it does is, rather than send you deeper into the subject, it derails you into what C.S. Lewis would call building your own sandcastle. And this is where, okay, here's the other really crucial thing that you have to get. When Barfield is talking about the imagination, he is not using it as a synonym for the good. Imagination in Barfield's terms is not simply the good. And in fact, I'm going to read you something. I've used this quote in other places before. I will undoubtedly use it again because I consider this so crucial. And this is from Saving the Appearances. It's one of the few quotes that I've actually bothered to extract from the book and keep it with me on my computer at all times. He says, imagination is not, as some poets have thought, simply synonymous with good. It may be either good or evil. As long as art remained primarily mimetic, as long as it was basically about imitating what you apprehended in the outside world, the evil which imagination could do was limited by nature. Again, as long as it was treated as an amusement, the evil which it could do was limited in scope. But in an age when the connection between imagination and figuration is beginning to be dimly realized, when the fact of the directionally creator relation is beginning to break through into consciousness, both the good and the evil latent in the working of imagination begin to appear unlimited. And I've mentioned this phrase, a few people have heard this phrase, directionally creator, and went, huh? What does he mean by that? Now, that was like the tone that someone asked in some comment at some point. Well, the truth is, what he means by that is that, it's like in the Heisenberg principle. You affect what you see. So, Rookmacher has the idea that you see what you know. It's not simply that you know what you see, but you see what you know, which means you're limited to what you see by what you know. You can't see certain things. And one of the things you don't see is how you affect the world you're in. Now, of course, we see that we're building all of these things and changing the world around us, but we actually, in some way, help to create the world around us in a way we don't understand. And he's going to explain this in a moment, but this is one of the things he's saying. These are complex ideas. I'm not doing them justice. Read Saving the Appearances and a lot more by Barfield to understand it. We have seen in the Romantic movement an instance of the way in which the making of images may react upon the collective representations. And that is to say, he says we all see something together that we have created. And here's the scary thing. So now we're seeing through the computer, through the camera lens. And a lot of people think, well, great, that opens up the world. No, it doesn't. It shuts it down. For the very same reason that you can no longer find God in nature, guess what? In order to see God in nature now, you have to go through what? YouTube? What are you going to see? See, it's not there. And that's the point, is that what we're seeing is the simulacra, to use the Baudrillard's term. What we're seeing, Paul Virilio talks about that every new device we have for seeing is one more way in which we are blinding ourselves. And this is absolutely true. You don't really understand. It's like I've had people who have just enough philosophical language to challenge me on certain things. And I'm just simply sitting there, and I really mean this. I'm just like, please, let me take you to Alaska. Let me take you and wander you off a mile or so off the road. And let me just tell you, I've got a perfect dirt road to take you down. And I'm going to tell you all the way there about the size of the bears. See how tall I am? They go, yeah. Because I saw a bear that tall once, sitting down. And I want you to just get this idea that you're in the real thing. There's nothing that's going to distract you from it. And then what I'll do is I'll say, I'm going to take you out here about 5 miles down this dirt road. And I'm going to leave you there and let you walk back. You're going to experience an entirely different world than the one you've imagined through your reading or through... This is why when people say, yeah, everything's a narrative, it's a text of a text. I'm sitting there going like, God, I want to drag you out to something real. because you don't understand. And this is what Rookmacher's talking about. People have reacted to the Rookmacher thing saying, these things. And I'm sitting there going like, yeah, you're proving to me that you're reading, but you're not proving to me that you understand reality at all. And this is what Barfield is also getting at. So he talks about the Romantic movement. We have seen in the Romantic movement an instance of the way in which the making of images may react upon the collective representations. That instance, which I will be covering very much in depth in the Tourism and Reality series, is when people started to go to the Swiss Alps to see mountains, because they suddenly thought, oh my goodness, the mountains are something worth seeing. This was in the late 1700s, late 18th century. First time in history, people decided that this was the reason to go to the mountains. They created modern tourism. The Romantic poets created modern tourism. They also created the hotel industry at that point to go along with the tourism. And a lot of other things came with it, so much so that we all go around the world taking these ideas for granted. So, it is a fairly rudimentary instance, he says. But even so, it has already gone beyond the dreams and responses of a leisured few. The economic and social structure of Switzerland is noticeably affected by its tourist industry. That is due only in part to increased facilities of travel. It is due not less to the condition, whatever may be said about their particles, the atomic structure and such, that the mountains which 20th century man sees are not the mountains which 18th century man saw. And he's not talking metaphorically. If you understand that, you understand Barfield. He's not talking metaphorically. He's saying these are not the same mountains. And he goes on. He says, it may be objective that this is a very small matter, and that it will be a long time before the imagination of man substantially alters those appearances of nature with which his figuration supplies him. But then again, I am taking the long view. Even so, we need not be too confident. Even if the pace of change remained the same, one who is really sensitive to, for example, the difference between the medieval collective representations and our own will be aware that without traveling any greater distance than we have come since the 14th century, we could well move forward into a chaotically empty or fantastically hideous world. But the pace of change has not remained the same. It has accelerated and is accelerating. And this, too, is final participation. That's the point. Is that, for instance, consider what happened in Nazi Germany. That all came from one man's head and went out into the world. And the entire world changed because of one man coming up with this idea about how the world should live. Now, people influenced him. There was a lot of other things going on, but it's hard to deny. But what he's talking about here, though similar in some respects to that historical example, we could very well move forward into a chaotically empty world or a fantastically hideous world. And look at what's happening to people now. We're bathed in propaganda. We have no sense of identity. We're desperate for it. And anything we can cling to call ourselves, we hold on to with a fervor which would make religious zealots of any cult envious. We have moved into this world. We're not totally there yet, but we're definitely in the suburbs. The big city is coming. And as he says, the pace of change does not remain the same. It has accelerated and is accelerating. We should remember this, he goes on. when appraising the aberrations of the formally representational arts. Of course, insofar as these are due to affectation, people are just trying to be cool, whatever, they are of no importance. But insofar as they are genuine because the artist has in some way or another experienced the world he represents. And insofar as they are appreciated by those individuals who are themselves willing to make a move towards seeing the world in that way. Eventually, robots and people will be getting married. It's already started. See my Conceptual Humanity lecture, which I also quote this passage because I find it so important for where we are. Insofar as they are appreciated, these changes, these aberrations in art, they are appreciated by those who are themselves willing to make a move towards seeing the world in that way, and therefore ultimately seeing that kind of world. We should remember this when we see pictures of a dog with 6 legs emerging from a vegetable marrow, or a woman with a motorcycle substituted for her left breast. Or might I add a mouse with what looks like a human ear grafted onto it. Final participation is not simply us reconnecting with the past. It is us rediscovering, for good or very possibly ill, that directionally creator relationship. That is to say, you look at the world we have today. Why does so much of it look the way it does? Can we thank the architects who had these in their brains? Just saying. Can we thank the people whose PR departments have just been churning out endless propaganda, which has poisoned our thinking? Could it be due to the progression of art into abstraction, but finally into noise, and the fact that we are surrounded in a culture of clutter and noise? And I don't just mean physically or audibly. I mean inside our head. The computer brings to us, the internet brings to us this noise. At the same time, what I think a lot of people would like to say is, well, there's final participation. We get to participate in things again. But again, why can't people sing together anymore? And it's really tough for them to sing together because they see themselves. They see themselves singing. And when they see themselves singing, they feel like they look like dorks. Or they make videos of themselves in order to look like stars, rock stars, pop stars. But whatever it isn't the natural, what humans used to do is sing together. Now, that singing together is not the original participation, although it comes out of it. But it is rather that sweet spot where there is meaning, but not too much in the wrong place. But now that for most of us there is none, and it's all endlessly reinterpreted so that, street graffiti equals Rembrandt, someone's blog post equals Shakespeare, it's all up for grabs. Well, actually, I think if we can get beyond our self-consciousness, we can actually enter into our lives with each other again. And it isn't until we learn to participate in that other sense, that is to say, to actually take part in things. I would say this: do you have a backyard? Can Can you see it beyond being a lawn or being some sort of crafted sculpture? Can you see something else there that maybe you want to make? I make art. And my art, I try to do fairly unself-consciously, but I'm also very aware of my predecessors. I'm aware of what I'm influenced by. But, like Tarkovsky says, I'm not interested in self-expression. I'm interested, it takes care of itself. I'm a self, I'm going to make something unique. But I am interested in, as Tarkovsky says, being a servant. That's part of final participation. I think a good way of final participation with involving the ecological systems is not to be part of some cult screaming to change the world, but rather to start with your own backyard and create something of beauty and meaning. Now, I've just opened the door here. And what I basically wanted to say is that final participation is not an eschatological thing. It is not simply, connecting back with people and church again. Those things, though, are important. Those to connect with the world around us. To me, it's so ironic that the people who are most want to see a world where there's no climate change and stuff are often digital nomads who have no connection to any specific spot and are spending gallons and gallons of jet fuel to get places quickly from one place to another. That is the tension. That's why even the people who all scream, we want to change the world, they are just more part of that idolatrous idea of the universe. Now, in a sense, we had to empty things out so that maybe we can, as Jacques Ellul says at the end of The Technological Bluff, maybe we can find a way to build the world which we've really been seeking to build. Okay, I don't know if this made any sense. But there it is. There are some ideas. If I had my Barfield books with me, I would have given you a lot more quotes, but hey, that might have gotten in the way as well. Thanks for spending some time with me, and the GoFundMe is still working as of today, which is Wednesday, June 9th. So if you're anywhere near this day, check out the link below and see if you can throw in a few dollars. Subscribe to the channel, hit like, might do something, I don't know. Evidently, if you hit the bell icon, you'll know when I drop something new. But you know what? Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And thanks for, I'm just impressed that anyone would spend time listening to anyone else. And if you're listening to me, I appreciate that. Because it's so easy to just live as if you were the only person on earth. And that's just not simply true. We can even take this digital junk and make something meaningful of it, as I am trying to do at this moment. So that is a bit of final participation. To not use it the way it wants to be used, but to use it the way it should be used. And to do that, you have to kind of swim against the stream, which is what Anadromous means. So we'll leave it right there.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.